for more than 5 decades. One name has haunted the FBI more than almost any other unsolved case in American history. A man in a business suit boards a plane, hands over a note, threatens a bomb, collects a ransom, and then steps out into the night sky, never to be seen again. No body, no parachute, no trace, just a legend that refused to die. Now, after 54 years, a retired airline captain, a dusty outbuilding in North Carolina, and 2 grown children carrying a secret their whole lives may have finally cracked it open. This is the strange, true story of how the FBI's most famous cold case came roaring back to life, and why the answer might not be as simple as everyone hoped. It was the day before Thanksgiving. Portland International Airport was full of holiday travelers rushing to get home, and Northwest Orient Flight 305 was scheduled to be a routine 30-minute hop north to Seattle. Nothing about it looked unusual, until a calm, middle-aged man in a dark suit, white shirt, and thin black tie took a seat, ordered a bourbon and soda, and lit a cigarette. He bought his ticket under the name Dan Cooper. Partway through the short flight, he passed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. She initially assumed it was a phone number from a lonely traveler and slipped it into her pocket unread. Cooper leaned over and quietly told her to read it. The note said he had a bomb in his briefcase, and he wanted her to sit next to him. When she hesitated, Cooper cracked open the briefcase, just enough to show what looked like a tangle of wires connected to red cylinders. His demands were specific: $200,000 in $20 bills for parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the tarmac in Seattle. If he didn't get all of it, he said, he'd bring the plane down. The crew radioed ahead, and within minutes the FBI had been notified. This was now a federal hijacking case. Northwest Orient's president personally authorized the ransom. When Flight 305 landed in Seattle, the passengers were released unharmed, unaware they'd just been part of what would become the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. The money and parachutes were delivered, and with a skeleton crew of 4 still aboard, the plane took off again under Cooper's orders, climbing slowly toward Mexico with its landing gear down. Cooper had given the crew very specific flight instructions: fly toward Mexico City, stay under 10,000 feet, keep the landing gear down, and hold the flaps at 15 degrees. A slow, unusual configuration that would force a fuel stop in Reno. He directed flight attendant Tina Mucklow, the only crew member left in the cabin with him, to join the pilots in the cockpit and stay there, somewhere between Seattle and Reno, in freezing rain and winds reportedly howling at close to 200 miles an hour. Cooper took off his tie, strapped on one of the parachutes, gathered the $200,000, which weighed roughly 21 pounds, and lowered the aircraft's rear air stair. Around 8 p.m., an indicator light in the cockpit flickered on, signaling the stairs had opened. When the plane finally landed in Reno, Cooper was gone. He'd left behind his black clip-on tie, a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and a handful of Raleigh brand cigarette butts, and essentially nothing else. The FBI's working profile, built from witness descriptions and his apparent comfort with aircraft systems, painted Cooper as a man in his mid-40s, familiar with Pacific Northwest geography, and possibly a former military man accustomed to static line jumps rather than free-fall skydiving, a detail that would later matter a great deal. By morning, hundreds of FBI agents, National Guard troops, and local police were combing the forests of southwestern Washington near the town of Ariel. Helicopters, bloodhounds, and search teams worked for weeks. They found nothing: no parachute, no body, no scrap of the money. The case, formerly known to the FBI as Norjack, would remain open for the next 45 years. Over that time, agents investigated more than 1,000 suspects. One man even confessed on his deathbed, though investigators concluded he simply wanted attention. None of the leads panned out. Then, in February 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, when he uncovered 3 decaying bundles of $20 bills, still held together with rubber bands. The serial numbers matched the ransom money exactly. It remains the only physical evidence from the case ever recovered, and it only deepened the mystery. Had Cooper drowned and the money washed downstream, or had someone planted it there decades later? By 2016, after exhausting nearly every lead it had, the FBI formally announced it was closing active investigation of the case, redirecting its resources elsewhere. The Bureau said it would still accept new, specific physical evidence tied to the parachutes or the missing $194,200. But for all practical purposes, D.B. Cooper had won. Nearly 50 years after the hijacking, no one could prove who he was, or whether he was even alive to jump. Along the way, dozens of named suspects rose and fell in the public imagination. In 2011, a woman named Marla Cooper told investigators she believed her late uncle, Lynn Doyle L.D. Cooper, matched the hijacker's profile. The FBI collected a DNA sample from L.D. Cooper's relatives and, that August, announced it was not a match. Barbara Dayton, a transgender Washington resident and pilot who reportedly told friends before her death that she was Cooper, was investigated and largely dismissed for not matching the physical description. A Purdue metallurgist theory, an oil executive theory, and a Green Beret named Kenneth Christensen all had their moment as the real Cooper in true crime media before fading. Each time, the pattern repeated. A plausible circumstantial story, followed by a forensic or descriptive detail that didn't quite line up. 5 months after Cooper vanished, on April 7, 1972, a strikingly similar hijacking played out over Utah. A man boarded United Airlines Flight 855 in Denver, passed a note to a flight attendant claiming he had a bomb, and demanded a much larger ransom, $500,000, along with parachutes. After collecting the money, he ordered the pilots back into the air and jumped somewhere over Provo. Unlike Cooper, though, this hijacker made mistakes. He left a handwritten note in the cockpit, and his fingerprints turned up on an in-flight water glass. Within days, the FBI identified and arrested him. Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr., a 29-year-old Sunday school teacher, Vietnam veteran, decorated Army helicopter and fixed-wing pilot, and criminal justice student at Brigham Young University. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Green Beret, working as a demolitions expert in addition to flying, and by several accounts also served as an LDS group leader who baptized fellow soldiers in the field. He was a husband, a father of 2 young children, and by every outward account, the picture of an upstanding citizen, a man, in other words, who looked nothing like the popular image of a hardened criminal. By the time of his own hijacking, McCoy also had extensive skydiving experience. According to reporting on his background, he'd logged dozens of military static line jumps as a paratrooper, and in the months before his hijacking he reportedly took additional freefall lessons from a civilian skydiving instructor. Practice that would have been necessary because static line jumps, where a cord automatically deploys the chute, work differently than the freefall jump the Utah hijacking required. McCoy was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. 2 years later, in 1974, he and several other inmates broke out of the penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, using a garbage truck. He was tracked down within months and killed in a shootout with FBI agents in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Given how closely McCoy's hijacking mirrored Cooper's, the same aircraft type, the same rear stairs jump, the same note passing, the same calm demeanor, investigators at the time did ask an obvious question. Could this be the same man? The Bureau ultimately said no. Witnesses on Flight 305 had described Cooper as being in his mid-40s, with dark hair and an olive complexion. McCoy was 27, fair-skinned, and noticeably younger-looking. The handwriting on the 2 hijacked notes didn't match either. Officially, the FBI treated McCoy as a copycat, not the original, and the theory faded into the background for decades, though it never entirely disappeared among amateur researchers, some of whom argued for years that a trained soldier capable of planning a heist down to the smallest detail would also be capable of altering his appearance and handwriting to throw off investigators. That's where the case sat until Dan Grider entered the picture. Grider is a retired airline captain, flight instructor, and skydiver who runs an aviation-focused YouTube channel called Probable Cause. He'd been fascinated by the Cooper case for roughly 2 decades, going as far as recreating the jump conditions for the hijacking's 50th anniversary in 2021. According to Grider's own account, reported by the Cowboy State Daily, Axios, and several other outlets in late 2024, the breakthrough came almost by accident. He and his son had stopped by a McCoy family property in Cove City, North Carolina, intending only to visit Richard McCoy II's grave before catching a flight. A renter on the property let him look around, and while poking through an outbuilding, Grider says he found crates containing an old military-style parachute rig, a harness, and other gear. He filmed the discovery for his YouTube series, calling the rig literally one in a billion. According to Grider, the parachute showed unusual, handmade modifications. The ripcord handle moved from the left side to the right, cut straps, added deering attachments, and other alterations, he says, match details from FBI files about the parachutes issued to Cooper in 1971, which were customized by veteran skydiver Earl Casey. McCoy's two adult children, Shantae McCoy and Richard "Rick" McCoy III, had reportedly believed for years that their late father was D.B. Cooper, but they told reporters they'd kept quiet out of fear it would implicate their mother, who had died in 2020. Once she passed, they said, they felt free to come forward. Along with the parachute, Shantae produced her father's skydiving logbook, which she said her grandmother had kept, showing practice jumps with instructor Larry Patterson in the months surrounding both hijackings. Grider's videos went viral enough that, according to his own account, the FBI reached out to him directly. In September 2023, he and Rick McCoy traveled to Richmond, Virginia, where FBI agents took possession of the parachute, harness, and logbook as evidence. Reporting from the Cowboy State Daily describes agents later searching the McCoy family's North Carolina property as well, and Rick McCoy has said he provided investigators with a DNA sample for comparison against genetic material recovered decades earlier from the clip-on tie Cooper left behind on the plane. That tie has long been considered the case's most promising physical clue. Forensic analysis conducted in the early 2000s reportedly found it carried trace amounts of unusual particles, including titanium, bismuth, and strontium sulfide, suggesting its wearer may have worked in aerospace, metallurgy, chemistry, or electronics manufacturing. A partial DNA profile was lifted from the tie in two smaller samples, plus one larger sample recovered around 2000 to 2001. Though the FBI has cautioned the tie's chain of custody has some uncertainty. It may have been borrowed or bought secondhand, meaning the DNA on it might not even belong to the hijacker. That partial profile is also the same one investigators used in 2011, when Marla Cooper's tip about her uncle L.D. Cooper prompted the Bureau to collect a comparison sample from his daughter. FBI Special Agent Fred Gutt announced that August that the tie DNA was not a match, while noting that the negative result didn't necessarily close the door on the L.D. Cooper theory entirely, given the tie's uncertain history. It's that same imperfect piece of evidence, degraded, ambiguous, and already burned once on a different suspect, that investigators are now said to be comparing against samples from McCoy's children. Grider has said investigators discussed the possibility of exhuming Richard McCoy's remains to obtain a clean DNA sample for comparison, though the FBI has never publicly confirmed whether that step was taken. The Bureau, true to its long-standing practice on this case, has offered almost no public comment throughout, declining to confirm or deny an active reinvestigation, and referring reporters back to its 2016 statement. It's worth pausing here on why the FBI dismissed McCoy as a suspect in the first place, because those objections haven't gone away just because new evidence surfaced. The eyewitnesses who saw Cooper up close described a man roughly 15 years older than McCoy, with a different build and complexion. The handwriting in the two ransom notes was analyzed and judged not to match, and when McCoy was shown to Flight 305's crew members after his arrest, none of them identified him as the hijacker. Grider and the McCoy children argue these differences can be explained. McCoy was a trained soldier who knew how to plan an operation and disguise himself. Stewardesses on his own Utah hijacking failed to recognize him from his mugshot just 6 months later, which the family says shows how easily his appearance could be altered. Retired FBI case agents and independent researchers who've spent years on Norjack see it differently, pointing out that circumstantial resemblance between two hijackings 5 months apart doesn't erase specific eyewitness and forensic contradictions collected in real time in 1971 and 1972. Both things can be true at once. The parachute is a genuine, tantalizing piece of physical evidence, and the case for McCoy still rests on interpretation rather than proof. There's also a simpler, more mundane explanation worth considering, one that doesn't require either a master criminal mastermind or a wrongly dismissed suspect. Skydiving circles in the early 1970s were a relatively small world, and military surplus gear was commonly bought, sold, modified, and passed between jumpers. A modified NB-8 rig turning up in the possession of a man who happened to be an experienced skydiver and pilot isn't, on its own, proof that the two hijackings were committed by the same person. It could simply mean McCoy owned or acquired a similarly modified parachute independently, whether because he copied Cooper's methods after reading about the case in the news, or coincidentally used similar equipment common to skydivers of that era with military backgrounds. Investigators who worked the case for years, including former lead agent Larry Carr, have generally been careful to describe the parachute as intriguing rather than conclusive, for exactly this reason. This is the part of the story clickbait headlines tend to skip past because the truth is messier than solved. According to Cowboy State Daily's reporting, the FBI held onto the parachute, harness, and other items for roughly 2 years of forensic testing, including DNA and soil analysis, before quietly returning them to the McCoy family in December 2025, without any public explanation of what, if anything, the testing found. Larry Carr, a former case agent who ran the Norjack investigation from 2007 to 2010, has noted that so much of the original 1971 evidence has been lost, discarded, or degraded over the decades that even a usable DNA profile from the parachute might have nothing reliable left to compare it against. Rick McCoy has interpreted the Bureau's silence itself as a kind of answer, telling reporters that by not saying the parachute isn't connected to Cooper, the FBI has effectively confirmed that it is. That's one way to read silence. It's also possible to read it as exactly what the FBI has always said about this case, inconclusive. Then, in January 2026, the FBI released several hundred pages of newly declassified case files. Reporting varied on the exact count, with different outlets citing figures between roughly 390 and nearly 700 pages. The documents consisted mostly of old interview summaries, tips, and suspect profiles, rather than a single decisive piece of evidence. They portrayed Cooper as unusually calm, methodical, and knowledgeable about aircraft and jump procedures, consistent with the profile investigators built decades ago. And they revisited a roster of long-discussed suspects, McCoy included. But the Bureau did not use the release to announce a resolution to the case. As of early 2026, the D.B. Cooper hijacking remains, officially, unsolved. No agency has confirmed McCoy's identity as Cooper. No DNA match has been publicly announced. The only unsolved commercial skyjacking in American history is still, technically, unsolved. It's also worth noting how ordinary most of that January 2026